a construction site, a confrontation. James Miller, chairman of a large corporation, walks into a place where no one recognizes him. All they see is a useless man. But he doesn't need to apologize. He just needs respect, and everything will change. Everything you know about power will be tested. But in this fight, who will really win? The man in the gray shirt is ready to change everything. Early morning. The sky was still covered in a light mist. The city had not yet fully awakened. In the southern suburbs, the construction site of the Our Victory Skyline project had begun to bustle. The sound of machinery echoed in the distance, the sound of hammers and steel clashing, the sound of safety shoes stepping on the wet concrete floor. In that scene, a middle-aged man walked in. He wore a light gray shirt without a company logo, old jeans, worn-out earth-colored sneakers. On his shoulder, he carried a brown canvas bag. No one recognized him. No one greeted him. A few workers just glanced at him and continued working. They thought he was an old geological surveyor, or a material delivery driver who had arrived early. Someone whispered, "Which uncle is lost here?" No one had the slightest idea that the ordinary man was James Miller, the chairman of the very corporation that was building this massive structure. James walked slowly through the large iron gate. He was not wearing a hard hat. He was not wearing a name tag. There was no sign that he was the head of the project. All he carried was a calm gaze and a hand lightly tightening the strap of his bag. He did not go into the executive office. He did not step onto the supervision area. Instead, he turned left, heading straight for the area where the northern foundation was being constructed. There, sunlight was just barely filtering through the large canvas flapping in the wind. Several young workers were busily tying steel bars, mixing cement, sweat beading on their foreheads. James stood a few meters away from them, observing. His eyes lingered on each operation, the way they measured, the way they tamped the ground, even the way they held their breath to check the right angle of the support frame. The eyes of a man who had built the first house foundation by hand. Nothing escaped his observation. An old worker standing nearby turned to look at him. They looked at each other silently for a few seconds. James smiled slightly, nodded. The worker nodded back, then turned away. No one said anything. But in that nod, there was a quiet understanding. James continued walking. Each step was slow, not hurried. Every time he stopped, he raised his head to look up at the iron frames, cranes, scaffolding, as if to imagine the entire future building. But in his eyes, there was more than just a blueprint. It was a dream, a person, patience, and kindness. That was how he always began. Quietly, quietly. No need for titles, no need for respect, just the truth. James stood at the edge of the concrete floor, where the stacked iron blocks were waiting to be fixed. The early morning wind blew gently, blowing a few old, forgotten drawings. He bent down to pick one up, dusted it off, and placed it neatly on a temporary wooden board. No one paid any attention. All around, the sound of metal cutting machines rang out sharply. A group of young workers were working hard nearby. James looked at them, his eyes lighting up when he saw a young man measuring distances while counting with extremely precise hand rhythms. He whispered, "Good," but no one heard. James continued walking towards the technical shelter. Under the corrugated iron roof was a row of whiteboards, displaying construction diagrams, progress zoning, and safety inspection schedules. He stopped, observing carefully. His hand lightly touched a notebox written in red pen, "Steel inspection on second floor, 2 days late." His eyes narrowed slightly, not because he was angry, but because he remembered, remembering every little detail like that. Not to punish, but to understand what was hindering the construction worker. Behind him, a project manager walked up with 2 others. They saw James, but just passed by as if they were an outsider. One of the group whispered, "Who's that not wearing a uniform and daring to stand near the progress board?" The other shrugged. "Maybe some old man got lost." James heard, but didn't turn around. No reaction. He just bowed his head slightly, as if silently apologizing for disturbing their space. A young engineer walked by, holding a stack of documents. He stopped, looking James up and down. No employee badge, no uniform. He asked quickly, not very friendly, "Do you need anything here?" James replied softly, "I'm just checking out the construction site. It looks like the progress is going pretty well." The engineer frowned. His face showed obvious discomfort. He said, "Don't stand here for too long. Not everyone is allowed to access the technical area." Then he left, without waiting for a response. James stood still for a while after that. He watched the engineer's footsteps, not angry, just silent, because he understood that in a hasty look, people easily overlooked things that were deeper than the surface. Even in construction sites, where large buildings are built, people's hearts can still be narrowed by haste and prejudice. An old hard hat lay scattered under the table. James bent down, picked it up, and hung it on a hook. That small detail no one noticed, but to him, order was part of respect. Respect for the work, respect for the workers, and respect for the place where he was standing. James left the layout area. He continued along the temporary corrugated iron corridor that led to the concrete pouring area. The smell of fresh cement, the hum of pumps, and the loud shouts of workers echoed in the early morning wind. It was a morning like any other construction morning. The only difference was that someone was walking silently among them, unbeknownst to them. Near the edge of the concrete pouring area, a group of young engineers were checking the formwork system. One of them, the engineer from earlier, suddenly noticed James approaching. He frowned, stepped out to block the way. A voice spoke, clear and impatient. "What are you doing here?" James stopped. He looked around, saw the workers working intently, no one paying attention to him. He replied softly, "I just wanted to check the progress here, from the looks of it. The team was working pretty steadily." The engineer crossed his arms. The voice became harder. "This is a restricted area. No unauthorized people are allowed. And you don't have a card or a hard hat. You're obstructing the work." You know, James remained calm. He nodded slightly. "I understand. I'll leave right away." But the engineer didn't stop. He curled his lips, half sarcastically, half angrily. "A construction site is not a park. Those useless old men should stay home. If you're careless here, people will die in no time." The words were like nails hammered into the air. A few nearby workers turned their heads. One paused. The other frowned slightly. No one said anything, but the atmosphere immediately became heavy. James slowed down for a second. His eyes moved slightly, but he didn't respond. He just took a step back. His voice was low, even, and calm. "Sorry for disturbing you." Then he turned around. "Walk away." The engineer pursed his lips and turned back to the blueprint. A few colleagues looked at him with puzzled eyes. An elderly worker whispered, "Do you know who he is?" He shrugged. "An outsider. You can tell by looking." No one spoke. Only the sound of the concrete pump hummed again. The sound of construction continued, but in the hearts of some people, something was out of sync, not because of who James was, but because his silence made people suddenly feel guilty. James walked out of the concrete pouring area and stopped in front of a newly built wall. He placed his hand on the rough brick surface, a very light gesture, as if he was listening to the voice from the silent brick itself. After a while, he let out a soft breath. Then he walked away, not once looking back. James turned into the area behind the rest house. A row of dusty benches lay still under an old corrugated iron roof. There were a few safety regulations posted there, but the words had faded with time and dust. He sat down on a wooden chair, his back leaning lightly against the wall. His eyes looked towards the bustling construction site. His hands were clasped together in front of his stomach, silent. Not a word of complaint, not a frown. No one passing by paid any attention to him. A few workers passed by, their eyes glancing and then moving away. A young worker reminded his friend in a low voice, "Were you yelled at earlier? Why are you standing there and embarrassing yourself?" James heard it, but he didn't move. He just bowed his head slightly, as if agreeing that he had really disturbed them. A moment later, someone brought water to the group of engineers, but no one thought about the man sitting on the sidelines. He was like an old tree by the roadside, big enough to provide shade, but no one looked closely. The phone rang from the executive office. A man hurried out, holding a hastily printed file, accompanied by a notice from the assistant general manager. "Prepare for an urgent meeting. All department heads go to the ground floor." Now, the atmosphere suddenly changed. The people with positions were in a hurry. The phone rang continuously. A group of engineers whispered, "What's going on?" "It's not a regular meeting. I heard that someone from a higher-up visited the construction site this morning." The young engineer who had just yelled at James was also called. He frowned and turned to a colleague. "Do you know which boss is coming this morning? I only saw an old man lost." The friend did not answer, just looked at him sternly. James stood up. He brushed his sleeves lightly, walked towards the office building. His steps were calm, his gaze still as calm as ever. No one called his name. No one held him back to apologize. No one thought that, in just a few minutes, everything would change, and they would no longer dare to call him useless old man again. The ground floor of the construction site management building suddenly became strangely quiet. All the department heads, technical team, supervisors, and safety workers were present. Each person sat neatly at the long plywood conference table. The white light on the ceiling was not enough to dispel the tension spreading in the small room. The door swung open. A man in a black suit walked in. He was the senior assistant to President James Miller. No introduction, no beating around the bush. He went straight to the large screen mounted on the wall. His hand pressed the projector. The screen showed an excerpt from the early morning security camera. Image, a middle-aged man in a gray shirt, was walking into the construction site. No one stopped him. No one recognized him. Then the camera footage from the concrete area appeared. The excerpt of the conversation rang out clearly. "What are you doing here? You're getting in the way, you useless old man." The conference room froze. No one said anything. Just a soft sigh. Some bowed their heads. Some looked at each other in shock. The engineer who had said that had turned pale, and his hands were shaking slightly. The assistant general manager turned off the screen. He stepped back, making room for someone who had just entered. That person was James Miller, still in the gray shirt, still walking calmly, still with gentle eyes as if nothing had happened. He didn't sit down. He didn't look at anyone in particular. His voice rang out, not loud, not stern, just loud enough for everyone to hear. I don't need everyone to bow their heads and apologize. He paused for a few seconds. Then he continued, I just need you to remember, on this construction site, no one is useless. The person in the shirt or the person in the safety vest all contributed to this building. If you can't respect others, you don't deserve to be trusted. He pulled out a payslip from the folder he brought with him. Place it in front of him. His voice dropped. As light as a cut, I've decided to increase the salary of the entire construction site by 15% this month. Everyone froze. James raised his head and added, except for one person, silence. No one asked anyone. No need to name anyone. That person, he knew himself. James nodded slightly, then turned away. The door closed behind him. The room fell silent. Only the sound of swallowing and the gaze on the young engineer who bowed his head, unable to say a word. After the meeting, the crowd dispersed in silence. No one said a word. The usual laughter in the hallway had also disappeared. Instead, there were only hurried footsteps and avoiding glances. The young engineer, Dylan, was still standing in the room. His head was bowed. His hands were clutching the notes so tightly that they were wrinkled. No one asked him to stay, but he himself did not dare to step out. The ceiling light shone down silently. On the table, the file was still open. The first page was this month's salary allocation table. Everything was adjusted upward, except for one line that was crossed out. Name, Dylan R. Title, Structural Engineer. Note, bonus suspended, pending reevaluation in the next period. No punishment, no disciplinary documents, just a cold note, but heavy enough to make the young man's hands tremble. Outside, James had returned to the construction site. He was still walking around the concrete pouring area, quietly, like early morning. But this time, the workers looked at him differently. An older worker approached, handing James a bottle of cool water. James took it, nodding his thanks. No words, no questions asked, only understanding in his eyes. A few young managers whispered to each other. Why didn't the boss fire that engineer? Just an email. And he was gone. Another voice replied, because he doesn't want to teach people through fear. He wants to teach them a lesson they will never forget. That afternoon, the construction site was bustling again. But the atmosphere was different. Everyone worked with more concentration. Every word between colleagues became more careful. And the engineer Dylan changed too. He no longer raised his voice to anyone. Instead, he quietly took notes, quietly helped new workers, quietly bowed his head when passing by the old workers. Sometimes, the most expensive lessons did not come from scolding, but from a silent look and a sentence as light as the wind. I don't need everyone to bow their heads and apologize. I just need you to respect me. The bell rang at the end of the day. In the sky, sunlight touched the silver-gray shoulders of James Miller as he slowly left the construction site. No one stopped him, but everyone stood and watched, because for the first time, they saw a real leader, not by his title, but by the way he quietly picked up people's hearts from where they had been dropped. The next morning, the atmosphere at the construction site had changed. No more noisy jokes during breaks, no more casual words that passed by without anyone paying attention. Everything became slower, quieter, and more careful. Workers began to greet each other more. A nod, a seemingly small "good morning," became the beginning of something. A young worker bent down to pick up a hard hat for his friend who had just dropped it. A manager walked past the material truck driver and smiled, saying, "Thank you, you're so early." No one talked about yesterday's meeting. No one mentioned the raise, but everyone knew. It had changed them, not by the numbers on the spreadsheet, but by the feeling that was clearly seen, that a quiet person could shake up the whole group. Dylan, the young engineer, arrived earlier than usual. No one told him to do so. No one noticed his footsteps as he entered the building before the sun had even set. He got himself a clean uniform. He carefully buttoned his shirt, put on his employee badge, and put on his hard hat properly. He went to check all the steel supports on the 3rd floor. Not because he was told to, but because he knew that yesterday he had not only been rude, he had also missed out on a lot of things worth learning. The people who used to talk to Dylan now just kept quiet when they saw him. No one said anything harsh, but no one asked him to go to lunch with them like before. He became a silent name in the crowd, not pushed away, but not accepted back either. Dylan understood that, and he did not avoid it. He just worked quietly, studying quietly, fixing every little thing in his behavior that afternoon. As Dylan was making notes of a small flaw in the base of a concrete beam, he heard a soft voice behind him. "You're doing well." He turned around. It was an older worker, thin, weather-beaten. He didn't smile, but his eyes were no longer distant. Dylan paused for a moment. Then he nodded slightly and replied, "I'm trying." The man said nothing more. He just patted Dylan on the shoulder and turned away. But that pat, it was lighter than praise, but heavier than any punishment. It was a sign that maybe, someday, people would trust him again. Lunch break. The atmosphere at the construction site softened under the midday sun. The sound of machinery stopped. The workers retreated to the shelter, opened their lunch boxes, poured tea, and chatted and laughed. On the outermost row of chairs, Dylan sat alone. The stainless steel lunchbox was placed on his lap. Intact, he bowed his head, holding a spoon in his hand but not picking up any food. His face no longer had the wild look it had on the first days he arrived. There was only silence and fatigue. A few people passed by him. No one looked at him for long. A few eyes paused for a second, then swept away. There were no contemptuous looks. There were no friendly eyes either. It was just, they didn't know how to deal with someone who had insulted the chairman himself. Another group of engineers sat not far away. The group chatted animatedly, but when someone asked, "Where's Dylan? Should we call him to eat together?" The group was silent for a few seconds. One of them smiled wryly. Let him be. He must be embarrassed. Dylan heard everything. Each word was like a gentle breeze passing by his ears. It didn't hurt, but it penetrated. He put down the spoon. He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pocket. On it were lines of blue ink. The handwriting slightly shaky. "Dear Mr. James Miller, I apologize for my thoughtless words that day. I don't know who you are, but that's no reason to insult a person. I was wrong. I apologize." He paused, sighed, folded the paper, then opened it again. He changed a word, then tore the paper again, put it in his pocket, then took it out again. The paper was crumpled, just like his mood at the moment. No one forced Dylan to apologize. No one asked him to write a letter. But inside him, there was a struggle between the self who once thought he was right and the self who was learning to admit his mistakes. Outside the shed, the sun was already mild. The afternoon bell rang. Everyone returned to work. Dylan stood up, still clutching the torn piece of paper. He didn't send it. He didn't submit it. He didn't dare to face it. He just quietly walked out. Returning to the construction drawings, on the way, a material transport vehicle passed by, stirring up dust that covered his back. He didn't brush it off. He didn't complain. He just kept going. In his heart, he was no longer burdened by other people's eyes, but because of himself. He still didn't have the courage to say the two words, "I was wrong." The afternoon slowed down. The sun was no longer harsh, only a pale yellow light gliding through the scaffolding. The wind blew in wisps of dust. Above, a bird flew across the sky above the unfinished construction site. Dylan stood on the second floor. He checked the joints himself. No one had assigned him the task. No one had checked. But he did it anyway, as a way of correcting himself. His hands were covered in concrete dust, sweat running down his neck. His forehead wrinkled, not from fatigue, but because his mind was still drawn to the words on the crumpled piece of paper in his pocket. During a break, he pulled it out again. It was still the unfinished letter. Only the handwriting was no longer crossed out. Only 2 sentences remained. "I'm sorry. I'm trying to be worthy of forgiveness." Dylan looked at those 2 lines for a long time. Then, he folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket. This time, no tearing, no crumpling, just leaving it alone, as if keeping a promise to himself. At the end of the workday, the workers began to leave the site. Some got on the van, others cycled, walked, or sat down near the main gate. Dylan was in no hurry. He washed his hands, took off his hat, and sat down on the edge of the technical shed, where James had sat that morning. The afternoon sun covered the ground in a pale yellow layer, and then the silhouette of a man appeared at the entrance to the site. James Miller. Still in the gray shirt, still walking slowly, leisurely. In his hand was a paper cup of coffee. The wind blew his hair. His face was still calm as before. Dylan paused. His eyes widened. His hand quickly touched his pocket. The letter was still there. He stood up, but did not step forward immediately. His chest pounded. Take a deep breath. James sees him. He stops. Not surprised, not indifferent, just a slight nod. Dylan approaches. Each step feels twice as heavy as usual. He stops a few paces away. Look up. Say softly, but firmly, "I am sorry." James looks at him. A moment, then a slight nod. Dylan lowers his head. His voice trembles. "That day, I didn't know who you were, but I know what I said was wrong. Even if you were just a normal person, the air is quiet. Only the distant sound of the concrete mixer fan is heard behind him." James raises his coffee cup, takes a small sip, then he answers, his voice even and slow. "You weren't wrong to ask someone to leave the danger zone." Dylan looks up, his eyes waver. James continued, "But you're wrong to think you have the right to judge a person by their appearance, and wrong to use words to make someone feel small." Dylan nodded. No defense, no apology, just nodded slowly, as if accepting everything he had to hear. He pulled the note from his pocket, handing it over with both hands. "I was going to send this, but I guess I don't need it anymore." James didn't take it. He looked Dylan in the eye. He said softly, "You already sent it. By action, with that." He turned and walked away. His figure disappeared behind the sunshade. Dylan stopped. He held the note in his hand. No need to give it to anyone, just keep it as proof that he had started again, right where he had gone wrong. The next afternoon, the construction site was quieter than usual. Some crews were taking turns off due to the new manpower schedule. Dylan stayed late. He checked the iron beams in the concrete casting area on the ground floor. Only he and a few people were on duty. Suddenly, a familiar voice rang out from behind. "Still staying this late?" Dylan turned around. It was James, still wearing the same gray shirt, still walking calmly, holding a paper coffee cup. Dylan stood up straight, embarrassed. "I just wanted to check carefully." James nodded. There was a moment of silence. Then he asked softly, "Do you know why I still come to the construction site?" Dylan shook his head. James replied, "Because I used to be a construction worker like you." He looked at the unfinished scaffolding. "Back then, I was looked down upon because I didn't know how to use a laser measuring device. At that moment, I promised myself, if I had the power in the future, I would never let anyone feel like I was worthless." Dylan was silent. That sentence seemed to lift a mirror in front of him. He said softly, "Now I understand." James did not say anything more. He just patted his shoulder, then he left, leaving a silence deep enough for people's hearts to change. The next morning, Dylan arrived at the construction site earlier than usual. He stopped for a moment where James had sat, the old wooden chair next to the blueprint board. In his hand was a small notebook. No blueprints, just a blank page with the words, "Respect is the strongest foundation of any construction." He closed the notebook. "Stand up," from afar. A worker's voice called out Dylan, "Help me install the sunshade." He nodded, ran over, without hesitation. During the lunch break, someone invited him to sit at the same table. No one said anything about the past, but that silence was the warmest forgiveness. That afternoon, James returned to the construction site. He walked through the technical area, silently looking at each person working. Dylan saw him, nodding deeply. James responded with a gentle look. "No compliments. Don't repeat it. Just say, 'I see, you're doing well.'" End of the month. All the workers received their paychecks in the email. Dylan did too. He opened the letter, his eyes skimming over the numbers. The pay had not changed. He nodded slightly, not disappointed, but then, at the bottom, there was a small line, handwritten, in blue ink. "If you continue to work hard and change, next month will be different. J. M." Dylan squeezed his hand lightly. No smile, just stared at the line like a commitment. Between two men. The next day, he arrived earlier than everyone else. He personally wiped clean the progress board that had been covered in dust for a long time, hanging his hard hat back in place, shaking hands with each new worker on the morning shift. No one mentioned a raise. No one mentioned the past. But everyone felt Dylan was different. And in the far corner of the construction site, James Miller stood silently in the morning sun. Still in his gray shirt, still no one called his name. But everyone knew he was there. He smiled slightly. Then he turned away. No footsteps were heard. Only one thing remained, clear and silent as the morning light. Sometimes, changing a person starts with a look without judgment, and a patience that does not need to be spoken.